Recently, I came across a report from the Regional Cooperation Council on the security fears that residents in the Western Balkans have. Now, amongst the data, it found that 68% of Albanians believe the region is a safe place to live, compared to just 45% of Kosovars. Some of the biggest threats of security perceived by residents in the region included terrorism, organised crime, weapons trafficking and ethnic conflict along ethnic lines. Citizens were also worried about the impact of war on the economy and cyber threats, including fake news and disinformation. Furthermore, some 80% of those in the region wanted more collaboration between their law enforcement officials and the EU and NATO. I am joined today online by Charles Kupchan. He is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University in the United States, and a former security advisor and official in the National Security Council and US Department of State in both the Obama and Clinton administrations. He has also taught at Princeton University and written multiple books on international security and foreign and international policy. Good afternoon, Charles. Thank you for joining me today. Now, NATO has committed to upping its presence in the region, particularly in Kosovo, but there is a feeling of a sense of appeasement towards Serbia. Now, this is at a time they've bumped up the number of troops along the border, strengthened ties with Russia. Do you think that the fears of Kosovos are grounded in any fact? And do you think the outbreak of war along ethnic lines in Kosovo is a real threat to the region?
Well, there's clearly a risk of violence, and that's self-evident from the fact that we have seen several bouts of violence, most recently in northern Kosovo and Bansk. And you know, the situation in Kosovo has not dramatically improved since the country declared independence. And in fact, I think we've seen some backsliding of late, in which the government in Pristina has taken certain actions, such as trying to change license plates, identity cards, seating mayors in the north, despite the fact that they were elected by a tiny percentage of the population. These are deemed provocative by ethnic Serbs and by Belgrade. And as a consequence, a very constructive proposal from the EU, which has been on the table to normalize relations, is stuck. And we heard reports of the mobilization of the Serbian army along the border with Kosovo. NATO has been talking about a permanent increase in the size of its force in Kosovo. So yes, one has to conclude that isolated cases of violence are certainly likely, and those isolated cases of violence can escalate.
Now, I saw some previous comments of yours that you made to Radio Free Europe. You said that holding an election in the north, putting ethnic Albanian mayors in the north after Serbs boycotted the election, and pushing ahead with the phasing out of license plates were issues that stirred the pot. But my question is, if Kosovo is a sovereign state, is an independent country, are these not normal, regular, expected things that a state has the right to do? Are they not actions considered reasonable?
Well, there's no question that Pristina has a legal right, a moral right to want territory that is technically part of Kosovo, a sovereign, independent Kosovo, to attach them to the central government and to integrate them into a broader multi-ethnic society. Whether the steps taken by Mr. Kurti are productive, are constructive, is a different matter. And I do think that the current government has, in some ways, taken steps that have damaged Kosovo's case in the court of world opinion, in the sense that really going back to the initial war, the NATO intervention that led to the separation of Kosovo from Serbia, the court of world opinion was on Kosovo's side. And Serbia, Mr. Vučić, those that came before Mr. Vučić were seen as the problem. And you now have a situation in which the United States and the EU have been leaning on Pristina and have said, now Pristina is the problem. It's taking actions that have not been helpful when it comes to advancing the parties toward the deal that the EU has put on the table. So even if what Kurti has been doing is legally and morally justified, it may not be politically wise.
Citizens in Kosovo are also fearful of organised crime and arms trafficking. We saw the attack in Banska recently, where huge amounts of weapons were brought into Kosovo under the nose of NATO. How bad is the situation with weapons and arms trafficking in the region?
Well, I think that the situation in the Western Balkans, broadly speaking, is very problematic. We know that there is large-scale trafficking of weapons, smuggling of weapons, human trafficking, and I think in many respects, this problem stems from weak states. It stems from governments that don't have the capacities that we normally associate with the modern state, in the sense that they don't have complete control over society. They are unable to use police forces, bureaucracies, ministries to gain control over these flows of weapons and people. And in some ways, I think you have to get at the root of the problem, which is to build state capacity. And building state capacity over time requires the Western Balkans, I think, to be integrated into Europe. And that's why when it comes to Kosovo and Serbia, when it comes to the relationship between Republika Srpska and Bosnia and Herzegovina, these are issues that cannot be let to fester. And that's simply because they don't pose a risk just of ethnic violence. They also make it very difficult for governments to build state capacity and to create the functioning institutions that are needed to get control of illicit flows of arms and people.
The report also found that 80% of respondents want more collaboration between law enforcement and NATO and the EU. Obviously, Kosovo, Albania as well, they want EU membership. Kosovo wants to be a part of NATO. Do you see this as a reality in the next 5 years, 10 years for Albania and Kosovo?
Well, I do think that the Western Balkans, which received top priority in EU and NATO policy in the 90s, in some ways fell off the radar screen, mainly because of 9/11 and the switch in focus to the Middle East and the counterterrorism mission. More recently, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now a terrible war that's unfolded between Israel and Hamas. And as a consequence, I think that Washington, Brussels, European capitals have been distracted. But I also think that the trouble that is brewing in the region has garnered a new urgency in the West. You have, I think, in the Biden administration, a group of individuals that are Atlanticists by nature, including the vice president. The vice president has, the president, including the president, Mr. Biden, who has been very involved in the Balkans for quite a long time, and the people around him. And I think in Europe as well, you're seeing renewed engagement. And so I think that the region has suffered from the neglect that have come from Washington and the EU, but right now I think they're attempting to redress that neglect. And I'm ultimately an optimist. I ultimately believe that the region will end up fully anchored in Atlantic institutions. It's a question in my mind of when this happens, not if this happens. And that's in part because a number of the states of the former Yugoslavia are already there. They're in the EU, they're in NATO, or both. And as a consequence, the neighborhood is one that I think is oriented to the West. Now, the Russians are mucking around. They're trying to prevent that. They don't miss an opportunity to exploit political and ethnic divisions in the region. But I do think that we know where this story will end. It's just a question of how and when are we going to get there.
And there is a concern in the region as well that Russian influence and Russia's hand in Serbia could in turn destabilize Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and other countries in the region, Bosnia and Herzegovina. How realistic do you think this scenario is? How much of a threat is Russian influence to security in the region?
You know, the Russians have long sought to arrest the integration of the Western Balkans into Europe and Atlantic institutions. And whether it is the name issue between North Macedonia and Greece, Montenegro's accession to NATO, the viability of Bosnia and Herzegovina, intelligence operations in Serbia, Serbia's relations with Kosovo, you can find Russia's fingerprints as a spoiler. I do think that the trajectory is one in which Russia is losing its foothold. And that's in part because some of those cleavages that the Russians sought to exploit have gone away. The Russians failed to block Montenegro's accession to NATO. The Russians failed to prevent Greece and North Macedonia from arriving at an agreement on the name issue. And so I think little by little, Russian influence is waning. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine expedites that. Because even a country like Serbia that may not come out and side with Ukraine clearly and side with the West and impose sanctions, they see the same pictures that we see. They see a Russia that has carried out a bold act of aggression against its neighbors. So in many respects, I think what we're witnessing here is the last gasp of Russia's effort to prevent the Western Balkans from integrating into the West. It's not over yet, but I think that we will, over time, see a Russia that is effectively excluded from the region.
So from what I'm hearing, overall, you are optimistic that things are going to get better and that risks in the region are going to diminish.
Yes, and also I think one has to simply look at how full Russia's plate is. Right, the war in Ukraine is a huge drain on Russian resources and political capital. You then have to say, well, where else is Russia going to concentrate efforts? And I think the answer is, well, the Caucasus, Central Asia. They'll try to continue to keep a hand in Syria and Africa through Wagner. But because of proximity, because of distance, because of where the Western Balkans are, I don't think there's going to be a lot of energy and attention left over for that part of Europe. And so to the degree that the Russians are able to continue to play the role of spoiler, I think it will end up being in places closer to home, in particular the Caucasus and Central Asia, simply because it's easier to do it there than it is in the Western Balkans.
Charles, thank you very much for your time.